resign himself each morning to meeting the joyless burdens of his office, so too must the slave resign himself to the joyless burdens of his. Ambition ought to be confined to a desire to play your part as best you can each and every day. That Stoicism did not turn out to be the religion of the slave should not come as a shock to anyone. Despite its reputation for producing dour, joyless men, Stoicism flourished throughout the Greco-Roman world for the positive ideal it gave many to strive for. No one, especially the Romans, could argue with the Stoics' four cardinal virtues which they derived from Plato: wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. That the average Roman of the 2nd century disdained the committed Stoic was evidence more of their own anti-intellectual prejudices, and it took hard work and constant self-reflection to properly practice Stoicism, and let's face it, hard work and self-reflection were not necessarily the principles upon which the empire was now founded. On the other end of the philosophical spectrum were the Epicureans, who, though they pursued the same end state as the Stoics, a calm and tranquil mind, they went about it in a very different way. Founded in the early 200s BC by Epicurus, the purpose of this new philosophy was to help students attain a state of mind free from fear, pain, or turmoil. This was a radical notion in the ancient world, a place notorious for its fear, pain, and turmoil. Where Stoicism met the challenges of life head-on and demanded that they be endured, Epicurus exhorted his followers to identify that which caused them pain and then purge it from their everyday lives. Though the message was often misunderstood to mean that one ought to embrace hedonistic pleasure-seeking, the Epicureans were usually far more modest than their non-Epicurean neighbors. Guzzling wine is a fleeting joy that is balanced by the morning's hangover. Sexual inhibition leads to all manner of jealousies, fights, and misunderstandings. Hedonism, in other words, usually leads to more pain than pleasure. The true Epicurean simply cultivated a close circle of friends and enjoyed their company while dining on simple meals and partaking in non-disruptive pastimes like sitting and chatting. They took no part in politics, tried not to get involved in lawsuits, refrained from commercial activity, and generally tried to mind their own business. The only responsibility an Epicurean really had towards other people was to do unto them as he would have them do unto him. If the whole point of life was to avoid pain, there was no sense in inflicting it on others. That would just be wrong. The biggest thing Epicurus tried to remind his students was that they need not fear death. The fear of death was the single biggest source of all the chaos, disruptive violence, and anger that permeated society, and if one could conquer that fear, everything else would fall into place. To this end, he came out fully as a sort of proto-atheist, denying completely that the gods played an active role in the lives of mortal men, and that there was any sort of afterlife that you needed to worry about. You are alive now and have sensation. When you die, sensation will cease. There is nothing to fear because there will be nothing to feel. What you have today is all you will ever have, so don't waste your time spinning your wheels, worrying about something that will A, inevitably come whenever it wants, and B, won't hurt anyway. Beyond the misunderstanding over what the pursuit of Epicurean pleasure meant, it was this atheism that caused the Epicureans the most problem amongst their superstitious and highly religious neighbors. Because when you put the two together, you get a freaky stereotype of a nihilistic atheist who would just as soon ravage your daughter as look at you. Nothing could have been further from the truth, and by the standards of the day, the average Epicurean, like the average Stoic, was a model citizen. What few demerits you could honestly assess them with comes mostly from an unwillingness to engage in public life, which was a bit like a Roman choosing not to breathe. But it had nothing to do with the fact that you had to keep calling the cops on them every Saturday night. The philosophy students of 2nd century Rome, be they Stoic or Epicurean, usually came out of the upper classes, men with the means to indulge their peculiar habits. But not all of them were rich and educated. One of my favorite groups of people, and no doubt one of the least popular groups in their own time, were the poor philosophers. Lampooned off and on over the years, these were men who often had no prospects and no hope of any work beyond dull manual labor, who suddenly became enamored with philosophy, grew their beards long, and wandered the streets criticizing the material obsessions of their fellow citizens in between requests for handouts. These street gurus, who assured anyone who would listen that their poverty was not only a chosen state, but also of the highest virtue, combined effortlessly the roles of crazy bum and freeloading artist to produce a character unique to the classical world, the panhandling philosopher. The streets of Rome would have been a less vibrant place without their angry harangues and subsequent requests for cash. In all of these things we are left, I must say, with the picture of a civilization on the verge of decay. Education had become stagnant and counterproductive. The elites were either withdrawing into weird mystery cults or esoteric philosophy, and everyone else was focused on just trying to stay alive. The vision, dedication, and camaraderie of the Republic was all but gone, leaving in its wake an ignorant, self-absorbed society that had no idea what horrors were lurking beyond the frontiers, just waiting to smash the comfortable world the Romans had begun to take for granted. Unfortunately, due to time constraints, everything we've covered today has been little more than a thumbnail sketch of a thumbnail sketch. Any one of these topics, Roman education, the Eastern mystery cults, or ancient philosophy, could easily become the topic of standalone podcasts of their own, and so I would encourage you to take this episode as an outline for further study, rather than say the comprehensive final word on Roman rhetoric, which I can assure you it was not. If any of this stuff sparks your imagination, remember that Amazon or Powell's are both positively overflowing with books on all of these topics, usually at cut-rate prices too, because as much as we know how fascinating Seneca's Letters from a Stoic is going to be, the free market is under the impression that it can only charge $5 for it. Next week, we're going to follow the Romans through the course of an average day, from waking up and heading out the door, to the barber shop, the law courts, the afternoon bath, and the evening meal. 2 weeks from now, we're going to go on a tour of the provinces and wrap our heads around what the Romans controlled, how they controlled it, and what each region brought to the greater empire, be it natural resources or simply more soldiers for the legions. That will bring us up to the 100th episode, which I'm really looking forward to since you guys have filled the comment thread with some great questions. I'm going to put a deadline on submission, so if you haven't posted your question by the time next week's episode comes out, then you're just going to have to wait for episode 200 to come around before I'll be able to address it. This week's episode is brought to you by Audible. As you now know, Audible is the internet's leading provider of audio entertainment with over 60,000 titles to choose from. When you're done with this episode, go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome. That again is audiblepodcast.com/Rome. By going to that address, you will qualify for a free book download when you sign up for a 14-day trial membership. There is no obligation to continue the service, and you can cancel anytime and keep the free book that you got. You can also keep going with one of the monthly subscription options and get great deals on all future audiobook purchases. This week, I'm going to recommend A Distant Mirror by Barbara Tuchman, which has nothing whatsoever to do with Roman history, but is a fascinating account of the 13th century, a century as utterly catastrophic as our own dearly departed friend, the 20th. Just remember to go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome so that they know who sent you. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome, Episode 88, A Day in the Life. When the sun rose, so too did the Romans. For the country population, this was only natural. After all, they had to get out in the fields and get working. But even in the cities, a Roman daily life revolved around daylight. Across the empire, whether farmer or lawyer, slave or emperor, the first crack of light was your cue to get up and get going. The Romans made a number of civilizational leaps that helped bridge the gap between prehistory and the modern world, but one conspicuous absence was any sort of public streetlight network in their cities. This meant that whatever you need to get done today has to be done while the sun is still up. Once darkness fell, you'd better be safely back home, or you're going to be in for a long night. So there was no time to waste, and the Romans wasted no time. There was no such thing as a morning shower, a leisurely breakfast, or even a cup of coffee. The Romans slept in their underclothes, woke up, slipped on their overclothes, grabbed a glass of water, and maybe a few nuts or a piece of bread for breakfast, and were out the door literally minutes later. Vespasian liked to brag that he could go from sleep to ready for work in 30 seconds. But just because all Romans got started at dawn did not mean that they were all natural larks, as poor old Marcus Aurelius testified in a quote near and dear to my own owlish heart. Obviously pained to be forever awakened at such a hideous hour as dawn, the Stoic emperor chronicled his recurring internal debates as he fought each morning to do the right thing. At dawn, when you have trouble getting out of bed, tell yourself, as a human being, I have to go to work. Why am I complaining if I'm going to do what I was born to do, the things I was brought into this world to do? Is this really what I was created for, to snuggle under blankets and stay warm? But, you say, it's nicer here. I see, so you were born to feel nice? Is that it? Not to do things and experience them? But we have to sleep sometime, you say. And I agree. But nature set a limit on that, just as it did with eating and drinking, and you're over the limit. You've had more than enough of that, and when it comes to working, you're still below quota. This is usually the point where I personally would roll over and go back to sleep, but then again, I sometimes think I would have made a pretty lousy Roman. Once out of bed, the Roman farmer went off and did what farmers do. They worked all day in the fields, came home, ate some dinner, and went to bed. Since that's not a particularly interesting routine, I'm going to spend the rest of the episode focused on the lives of the folks in the city. Just remember as we go along, though, that 90% of the empire's population simply spent all day slaving away in the fields. When you get right down to it, for most Romans, that's what Roman daily life was. But again, boring. So, off to the city we go. Just as they did not linger in bed, Roman men did not linger at home either, and most were hitting the streets as soon as they physically could. Roman women during the age of the Antonines usually spent most of their days indoors, so after they woke up, they either fussed with their hair, if they were wealthy, or began the household chores, if they were too impoverished to have slaves do it for them. You'll recall from 2 weeks ago that the annual income of the average Roman was subsidized by the morning calls they paid to their patrons, and so naturally, that was the first thing the men did after waking up. The only men who remained at home during these crucial early hours were those high enough on the socioeconomic pyramid to be receiving visits, rather than making them. If you were rich enough, you rolled out of bed, welcomed in the waiting mass of clients, and began dispensing the daily allotment of cash and prizes. Clients were received in order of prominence, with equites cutting ahead of the lower-class schleps, and senators cutting ahead of them. The trick, then, was to get there early, so you could be received before the richy riches started showing up and forcing you to wait in the wings. That way, you could pay your respects, get your cash, and then get along with the rest of your day, or have time to hit up a few more patrons. For those of you wondering what the patron got out of all this, after all, votes were no longer a valuable